Well, I just want to say, is this right? Yep. Okay. Firstly, I just wanted to say that I'm honored and humbled to share the space with Denny Griffith, and that I know he was such an important member of your community, and I send my condolences to his family and his friends. And then, of course, I wanted to say thank you to Michael and Ian, who this has been one of the most wonderful experiences I've had with a museum ever, particularly the installation. I was saying to Michael, I never had anybody take these funny little objects out of their boxes without me instructing them how to do it. And I just was overwhelmed at what a great job they did with the installation and the depth of their work with me. And I'm really grateful for that. And I want to thank Andrianna for coming. And aside from that, she is absolutely so stellar in her field. She has become a very trusted colleague and now a very, very dear friend. So I'm very grateful. I'm grateful for all of you to be here, so thank you so much.
Great. So John and I actually met back in 2012 when Dan Palmer and I visited your studio, and that was the first time I had been in a physical space with the work. And I was struck when I saw it, and immediately we knew that we wanted to have you in the show. And the show was pretty historic. Basically, it was a show that looked at the 100 years since the 1913 Armory Show. The space we were doing it in had a 1963 reprisal that Marcel Duchamp had put together. So we really wanted some of the best artists internationally. We had a huge international show that we could find. And John was one of these artists that 28 that we chose. And it was after that moment, going into the studio, that initial conversation, that we started to talk more. And I would regularly visit you as you were working. And just over time, I've really welcomed the stories that you've told me about kind of coming to New York City, your training as an artist. So I thought, in terms of that generosity that you've given me, it'd be great to share some of that with the audience here. So where did you train, for instance, and who were your mentors as a student?
Yeah. Well, honestly, I don't have a background in art, oddly enough, even though once I tell you the story, it'll sound like I'm being disingenuous. I went to Oberlin College, and in 1969, I was 17 years old. I wanted to be a hippie and a poet, and my poetry teacher, David Young, hated me because I was a very brash young man with long hair. And I had gone to a high school supposedly for independent study and gifted children, one of these 60s experiments. It was really kind of a silly place. But when I got to Oberlin, it was the first time I ever met anybody who I really was overwhelmed with being smarter than me. I mean, it was just the kids at Oberlin were just amazing. And I was a little lost. I was young. And one of my friends in the circle, other than Douglas Baxter, was a kid we called Sicky. And he was sick smart. I mean, he was just the smartest kid we ever knew. And he introduced me to Gregory Badcock's minimal art book. I'd never seen minimal art. I'd never thought about art. And at the time, minimalism and early conceptual art seemed to me so incredibly radical. And I'd never seen anything like it before. And at that time, everything was about radicality. The women's movement, the free speech movement, street theater, Ornette Coleman, and I just took to it. It just seemed to click, and it also solved all the problems that I had with poetry, being a little bit too narrative and too
esoteric.
Yeah. So it really, I started taking a couple of art classes at Oberlin, really because I didn't want to write any papers.
We've all been through that, right?
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's interesting for me because when I typically ask you about your training, you bring up your time period in New York, working at the John Weber Gallery, being around this plethora of artists that even today, I remember when we saw Barbara Caston together, you said you remembered her from those days. Right. Would you talk about that time in New York and what it was like as a young artist?
Yeah. No, So I have another fun Oberlin story. Oberlin had a program called the Great Lakes College Association, which maybe, I don't know, some of the Ohio schools are involved in. And it was a kind of like a junior year abroad, but instead of going abroad, you went to New York City and worked with an artist. So at that time, I wanted to do that. And there was a list of all these artists that you could go, and many of them were really terrific artists. I remember Nancy Graves was on the list. I can't remember the other ones, but I didn't like any of the ones on the artists on the list because I thought I knew what I was doing. And I went to Ellen Johnson, who was the most, venerable professor at Oberlin at that time. And I remember, this is so embarrassing, but it's true. I was wearing overalls. I didn't have any other clothes on. I had really long hair. I was smoking a cigar. I think I was 18 years old. And I went into her office and I said, I don't want any of those artists. I want Sol LeWitt. And she said, well, he doesn't want you. And I said, well, how do you know? And she said, she sort of threw me out. So I went to home to visit my parents. I grew up in Queens. And I was in the Union Square subway station, and there used to be telephone booths in the subway stations, and I picked up a phone sort of out of piss and vinegar, and I said, do you have a number for Sol LeWitt? And they said, Hester Street? And I said, that's downtown, sure. So I said, put me through. So the phone rings, and somebody answers, and I said, hello, is this Sol LeWitt? And he said, yes. And I said, I'm the kid from Oberlin that you don't want. And he said, where are you? And I said, Union Square. And he said, come over. So I went to his loft, and I walked in, and he had all this art on the walls. He's a famous collector, aside from being a great artist. And I had recognized every single thing on his wall, but I'd never seen it in reality, only in reproduction. And I was so excited. And he said to me, I explained my situation. I said, if you sign my paper, I can get credit for a semester. I'd be called your assistant. He said, look, I have so many assistants. You're a nice kid, but... So then his girlfriend walked in the door, and he went into the studio, and she said to me, you want to smoke a joint? And I said, sure. And she says, I explained my situation to her, and I said, if he signs my paper, then I'll be his, he'll be my mentor. And so Sol comes back, and she said, Sol, give the kid a break. Sign his paper. Call up Andre, call up Smithson, call up Ryman. Maybe they need some help. Farm him out. And that's what he did. And he said, if you don't bug me, I'll sign your paper. And actually, it was the greatest thing. And then he got me a job at sweeping the floors at John Weber. He told me to go to Mel Bachner's class at SVA. I worked with Dorothea Rockburn. I painted Robert Ryman's hallway white, of course. I worked with Smithson, and I just lived in New York. I got credit for like a year and a half. Then I went on to the Whitney program. But I used to go to the bar, and there was one bar, and all the artists went. And at that time, it's very different now, the art world. It was very small, and you could sit down at the bar and talk to Lawrence Weiner or Jackie Windsor. And I felt like I learned on the street. And then I met young artists who were doing the same thing I was, and it was fantastic, And then Sol did help me. I mean, I didn't bug him, but I got into the Whitney program. Then I went to Yale Graduate School. So I did go to all these art schools, oddly enough, although I always felt that I know this is, again, sounds disingenuous, but I really never thought of myself as an artist in the sense that I never made anything. I was an idea guy. At Yale, David von Schlegel used to tease me. He'd say, you don't know how to use a hammer. All you do is read Wittgenstein. And that was my education. And it's still a beautiful but shocking thing for me to think that I make things.
Would you talk about, when I met you, I kind of went back and did my research, and I noticed a lot of had been written about you in terms of these large-scale projects that you've done, 2 of which are in Japan, and they're spread out all over the country. And I met you, and you talked about this shift from these monumental-sized projects to things that were table-sized. And I love that idea of the fact that you've kind of done both. Why make that shift? Why move from something that's kind of huge to making something on the table?
Yeah, well, that's sort of my life trajectory, really. When I was at Yale Graduate School, I made sculptures. They were like 64 feet long and 32 feet long. And actually, Ronnie Bladen was my professor, and I still feel badly he died. And he was a huge influence on me that I never recognized at the time, because I was interested in the more radical artists. I think also because I was so young when it all happened. I finished graduate school when I was 21, and I was very fortunate. I got a lot of attention as a very young man. I won these grants, and I got all kinds of shows and jobs and things. And I thought that what you were supposed to do as a young man was make big things. And I did. I remember I had a crew of like 10 guys working for me when I was 24. And I think what happened over a period of time is I felt that my work was being misunderstood as much more macho.
Sarah-like.
Yeah.
Sort of view that compared you to Sarah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like when you're a big, bald, well, I wasn't bald then, but when you're a big, straight sculptor guy, people think you have a pickup truck and you smoke Lucky Straights and you have chains and grease and, and I was trying to...
And you have all those things.
Yeah, right. And I thought my work was about something very, very different, and I did feel very misunderstood. And then, of course, around the early 90s, when there was the recession, I stopped making a lot of these big pieces because when you're doing well, dealers give you a lot of money to make these big things, but they tell you exactly what they want, and if you don't keep delivering, they don't want to keep giving you the money. And when the recession came, suddenly I felt like I had to beg for money, and I wasn't going to beg for money. And I had this academic job. I was the head of the Yale sculpture department, and installation was the reigning mode at the time. And I just felt dissatisfied and uncomfortable, and I had this wonderful sort of a epiphany moment. I quit my job at Yale, and I thought nobody cares about my academic credential in the art world, but it did allow me to get a grant. So I got a Fulbright, and I lived in India. And then I went to Japan, and then I went to Africa, and I went to China, and I went to Indonesia, and I saw that all these people had this very intimate relationship with objects. Like a Japanese teacup wasn't just utilitarian. It was, in the tea ceremony, you stare into the cup. It's like a poetic reverie, or an African Congo power god is, awesome in its physical presence. Or in India, there'll be, in a poor village, there'll be a stone. They don't even have enough money for a statue. There'll be a little aniconic stone that will be dressed lovingly with flowers and honey, and there was just this intimacy to this private relationship, and I felt that was really missing in the art world at the time. Matthew Barney's just exploded from Yale, and identity politics was kind of what I thought was journalism, but sort of on the rise. And I thought this was something really new. This was a new lexicon of sculptural possibility. And I came home and I just started making these small things, also because I could. I didn't need money, I didn't need dealers, I could be home. And really what it was about, it's almost like returning to poetry. I wanted to be able to sit at my desk and have a thought and make it.
And I thought it was really a brave thing to do. When an artist jettisons something that you know them for and goes on to make a completely different body of work, it is really brave, because you know how the art world, it can be. People want the same thing over and over and over again. But what I think that is so amazing to me is that these sculptures that you've made, I think Eloy Simmons called them distinctive objects. And in that reference, she's clearly alluding to Judd's specific objects. So I think that there is a relationship to minimalism. A lot of it has to do with seriality, reproducibility, the scale of them. But would you talk about how they're distinctive rather than maybe specific?
Well, that's complicated because...
I think I called them enigmatic in
yes,
my
you
essay.
did. Yeah. No, and I loved what you said. Specific objects was an extremely important article written by Donald Judd in 1965, I believe, and it was very important to me as a young artist. And one of the things that he talked about was how what he said was, and I'm obsessed with Judd, by the way.
But you never met Judd, right?
I never met Judd. He's the only minimalist that I didn't meet. Although I did recently go to Marfa. I was the artist in residence at the Judd place in Chinati, and I find Judd and Barnett Newman, really, who Judd, in a sense, extended, are probably the most, not the most, but certainly very important artists for me. And the article about specific objects was very important in that he talks about, again, this is the radicality. He says the best work at the time, this is the 60s, mid-60s, is neither painting or sculpture. He felt that sculpture was a really bad word, that sculpture was death enthralled for monuments and great men. And there is a tradition of that, at least in the West. This is one reason why I enjoyed seeing all this non-Western art, because there are other models, there are other premises besides the West. What Judd talked about, too, was that, or at least the way I maybe misinterpreted Judd in that Harold Bloomian sense, I was interested in the fact that materials, now I guess we're jumping ahead to talk about materials here, but that materials were, it didn't need to be medium specific, which is what sculpture had always been. Bronze, wood, metal, again, at least in the West. It was very interesting that once you see non-Western cultures, they were never involved with those kinds of restrictions. But we can talk about that another time. But the specificity of Judd was two things. It was about a new idea, about a new form. And then there was something else where he really got from Barnett Newman, which I loved, is that he talked about shared space. He said the greatest thing that sculpture has going for it is that it's here. And in the here-ness, there's a truth, because you share space with it. And in sharing space, you are in behavior. And I thought that was fantastic. And that was part of Judd's idea of taking the sculpture off the pedestal, because he felt that the pedestal was an illusionistic, privileged space. Well, this was very rich and interesting for me as a young artist, but one of the things by the time I got home from India and Japan that I liked was kind of this, what I thought was a radical gesture of, I'm going to put it back on the pedestal, because there are other kinds of spaces. Yes, there's the truth of shared space, but we talked about this before, there's the space of imagery.
Yeah. And I think the thing with Judd is that, I don't know if you guys know this, but like the stack sculptures, for instance, they're scaled to the body. So they're scaled to space, and they're supposed to have a kind of phenomenological interaction with the body. But what ends up happening is that the body that's assumed is like a male subject, right? It's this 6-foot-something subject. And so the subject is always the same. It's a kind of stable subject. And to kind of move past Judd, I think in some ways you're dealing with a different kind of, multiple kind of spectrum of bodies that can interact with your work. There's multiple kinds of subjectivities when you approach the work.
No, that's very important to me.
It's really exciting to look at.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about this many times, this, let's call it, I'd like to call it new idea, maybe that's a little bit presumptuous, but this idea that, for example, minimalism and the whole trajectory of modernism, which was basically about reduction, to try and find what Roland Barthes and others called the 0 degree. Trying to find the essential. And this manifested itself in minimal sculpture, painting, but certainly also in literature, Samuel Beckett, Yvonne Rayner's dance, Phil Glass's music. There was, even in science, the whole idea of finding the subatomic world. Everything was to go to that 0 point. And for me as a young artist, the challenge was, what do you do after 0? And after 0, if you think about it, is either the quantum world, which is all unpredictability, or the other side of Alice's mirror, or the unconscious. Things get strange on the other side, and also therefore more emotional, and more intuitive, and possibly less based on a kind of transitive function of language. X plus Y equals this. So that whole complexity was something that was really, really interesting to me. And what was the first part of your question? I'm going on and on and on about the 0 thing.
I think I was talking about
the Judd, the body. Yeah.
Body.
So the thing that, I know what I wanted to say, yeah. So I think now we're in a moment, whether it's the quantum world or the transgender fluidity or asymmetrical warfare or globalism, where binary relationships aren't working anymore. Things are more complex, things are more rich. So this idea of a multiplicity and possibility of entryway and subjectivity is something I'm really interested in, and I hope that's what my work speaks to. And even with the body in the sense of scale, but also in the sense of different kinds of spaces. We talked about shared space, but also the space of images.
Well, I think that one thing we haven't really talked about is the scale or the size.
Right.
And I know that, again, to quote Lori, because I thought she did a wonderful job writing about the work, when she says there's a lean-in scale to these, and you've talked about them being scale-less, both table size, but also immense and your kind of imaginary.
Right.
Would you talk about that sense of encounter with the sculpture?
Yeah, well that's another kind of space. So if we think about having a premise to understand space, so there's the space of shared space, there's the space of images, which is a pictorial space, that's an illusionistic space, which we usually associate with painting. I mean, another artist that I'm obsessed with who is pictorial space is Bernini. But then there's another kind of space, and that is the space of the model. So an object can represent something huge, like an architectural model. So the thing that's so interesting about that is, and then of course there are other kinds of spaces, like the object is utilitarian. So there are different kinds of premises for space, and I think what is relevant today, if not at least fascinating for me as a sculptor, is to be able to somehow experience a number of different ways of understanding yourself with the thing in a space. And that space is both physical and virtual. So the imagination space is much huger than any big sculpture. I mean, Richard Serra, is it that big? It's not that big. It's not as big as a mountain. A Joseph Cornell box is bigger than a Richard Serra because it's an imagination space. And I would like to hope that with my sculpture, this sense of both intimacy, of like really getting in there in that like private, almost sexy way, and at the same time this thing becomes a kind of possible representation of some huge thing that you kind of project in your imagination, and to actually be doing those kinds of things simultaneously so that it's not analytically fragmented is, I don't know, I think that's really compelling.
And that leaning in is not just optical, it's also almost haptic. You get the sense of desire. I mean, I always want to touch them because of that kind of biomorphic curve or something about the color or the light, the change in materials. Makes me want to fiddle around with them. And what's that German word that you used? I can never get it.
I know. I have this funny little word that I learned when I was in Germany called Fingerspitzengefühl, which literally means fingertip feeling. But Fingerspitzengefühl is both the sense of texture. This is corduroy, this is steel. But Fingerspitzengefühl also means intuition. You know, like I meet you and I get a Fingerspitzengefühl. I don't know if I really like you. So I believe that is very much a part of sculpture. Like when I used to like to say that sculpture's a little like two dogs meeting. Like, can I, two dogs, they get close. Like, can I get closer? Should I not get closer? Can I get in there? If I get in there, am I going to get bitten or am I going to get licked? And that kind of tendency, I mean, I think it's very sexual. I mean, I think sculpture is fundamentally, in its haptic way, it's very sexual. And yet, it also connects to other kinds of, let's call it, intellectual, historical, referential information. And what I'd like to say is these things are not severed. You don't separate one from the other. And that's one of the beautiful things about an artwork, I think, that when you're a philosopher and you're talking about experience, you have to remove yourself from the experience to address the experience. When you have an experience, you don't analyze that experience, right? You dive in the cold water, you're not saying like, oh, is it 32 degrees? So the beautiful thing about looking at art is it's one of the few things that I can't think of that many other things that you do this with, because it's not narrative, at least in my case.
In my case it is.
But I think there's no differentiation or severance between experience and analysis. It's something you're doing simultaneously. I mean, when you look at a Cézanne, it's experience and analysis in a kind of intimately woven way. And that, I find that absolutely stunning.
One thing that I often think about with your work, and I explore in my essay, is this interaction between the kind of inorganic, machine-made forms, the kind of extruded aluminum, for instance, that's often a material in the sculptures, and then things that seem to emulate the organic or are themselves organic. How do those two things rest with you? Because I know that as an art historian, I often think of like Carolyn Jones's work about the machine in the studio,
Right.
and the kind of rise from David Smith through the minimalists to the kind of the machine, the fabrication, the outsourcing. And I think that, I mean, you know, Stella and the Day, you know, I think that in your work, going back to the handmade while incorporating some things that are machine-made, you're really doing something interesting in terms of juxtaposition. Would you discuss that?
Yeah, thank you, yeah. Well, again, this is part of this spectral idea. I think about, it's not merely like organic versus inorganic. It's a wide range of possibility that I keep happily widening. So at first I thought if I used non-traditional art materials, particularly materials that had a kind of ephemeral sense, like tulle, you know, and I was thinking, of course, of Degas' ballerina and women, you know, because I think that whole sculpture macho thing is so tired. So I really wanted to use very delicate things that were barely there as a metaphor, as a absolutely obvious, meaningful metaphor for that kind of hovering sensitivity and delicacy. Then I found there were certain, that I could do this with processes, that certain materials, whether it's steel, everybody knows what steel is, everybody knows what glass is, it's breakable, it's transparent, it has meaning in and of itself. All materials have different kinds of possibilities. Organic, inorganic. Then I started working with computers. I worked with glass blowers. I worked with weavers. I would make handmade things. I'd have my assistant make something. So it was a wider and wider and wider spectrum of possibilities for hopefully a richer poetic vocabulary. And then, sort of unwittingly, I started using found objects. And found objects we usually think of in the Rauschenbergian sense of a kind of pop sense, like something recognizable.
Assemblage.
Assemblage, yeah. Right. Or a cornflakes box or a Brillo box or something like
pop,
that.
Yeah.
And I wasn't interested in that. But I did find myself sort of going around the world and finding things or commissioning craftsmen to do things or just finding a stone. And then I started folding that into my work. And therefore, suddenly I had things made, things found, things accidental, like the extrusion. You'll see this, these sort of industrial accidents. And really, all of it was in the service of my great goal and challenge is not only this spectral vocabulary, ever widening, but trying to make something I've never seen before.
Well, you know, Steele Stillman, who's the editor-at-large of Art in America, wrote about your work, and he talked about the use of computers, and something that I'm very interested in, the kind of early computer history. I'm working on a piece for Artforum about that. Talk to me about why computers and maybe kind of your interest in bending space, because I know that you've dealt a lot with non-Euclidean geometry in your work.
Yeah.
And so why was the computer an immediate interesting tool for you?
Well, actually, the computer came later. I mean, I got interested in non-Euclidean geometry, which is...
but I mean early in terms of artists using, you know.
Yeah. Well, what happened with the computer was the computer, especially for architects, Frank Gehry was really the first one. Because of AutoCAD programs, they could make these complex curved surfaces that were very difficult to make. I mean, in standard material, You either have wood or metal, and that's flat, and you can have precision, and you can have angles, welding, and things like that. Or you have viscous material, which is clay, wax, plaster, and then you can have globby formed organic shapes, but you can't have precision. And I was always interested in trying to find a way to have the haptic, sexy, sort of strange, curvy form, but I wanted Juddian precision. So it was almost a technical challenge to find a way to go in between those two things. And I actually tried to figure out how to do it by hand, and I did for years, and then I noticed, oh my God, these computers are doing this like so quickly and easily, and like, I better get on board, you know? So that was, you know, it was a tool. A computer is no different than a pencil. It's another tool in the toolbox, although one of the things it can do that is very difficult to do is you can set up certain points and tell the computer, and I've done this before, to connect the points and make a form that you can't envision. You can program it, but you can't see it. So the computer actually makes the form itself.
And I think of some of the titles, like Ask the Fact, the Form, or something like that. And I have this sense in the work of like found, it's like a ready-made form or ready-made color, like the powder blue piece. And would you talk to me about that? Because these things are so basic in terms of when we think about how an artwork is made, form, color. In terms of those things being a ready-made or something that can be found, I just find that really fascinating part of your work. And I'm not sure if it comes out of your interest in linguistics or I know your father was a linguist, but would you discuss that?
Well, that's several questions
Sorry,
at once.
I just got so excited.
Yeah. You mean like how do I make them?
Well, no, it's just, I just think that the idea that like color or form could be a ready-made is just really.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
Like striking, just
Yeah.
because historically we think of Duchamp finding a wine rack,
Right.
and that's a much more complicated object,
Yeah.
and that being a ready-made. Sometimes I think that your sculptures, even though they read as really complicated in terms of materiality, sometimes I think they can be really simple as well.
I hope
and
so.
there's a
I
beauty
hope
to
so.
that
Yeah, I hope so.
simplicity,
Yeah.
that you can just take it in,
Yeah.
just look at it and appreciate it.
Well, I guess I have two things to say about that. One is I have what I call my liver transplant theory, where like if I'm using different components, I feel like, will this component from a foreign universe come into this system and make it healthy again, and therefore it can live, or will it kill it and die? So that idea of what John Chamberlain called fit, like how things connect, is very important to my work. As for the ready-made, I do begin, and this is a real issue about how do you begin a sculpture. I often begin with vocabulary, meaning these parts that I have, or I might begin with a color. I mean, for a while there, I'm sort of off it now, but there are many pieces in there. I wanted to use colors that you didn't know where they came from. I mean, when do you see a lavender sculpture? It was thrilling. When do you see lavender? Well, you do see lavender out in the world. Yes, that's true, and it's beautiful.
But usually not in sculpture.
Usually not in sculpture. Yes, yeah. So I do. At this point, I've been doing this now like 40 years. And this is a difficult thing to talk about, but it's personal, it's emotional, it's intuitive. You work for, I don't have children, I don't have property, I don't have hobbies. This is all that I do, and I live in it. I live in my studio.
You're always working. I call you and jazz is on, you're working, you're in the studio.
Yeah, no, we should talk about jazz. But I don't sit down with a very specific idea at this point. Like a jazz musician, I feel like I have my horn, and I've been doing this a long time, and I love it. I mean, I just love it, and I just want to blow.
Yeah.
It's like Ornette Coleman. Do you know who Ornette Coleman is? It's like Ornette Coleman. He's so radical. There's no melody, there's no song. He's not improvising off of a classical standard. He just steps up and he blows. And, you know, I'm going to be 64 years old now, and I was always the young guy, always. And, like, suddenly I realized, like, wow, you know, I don't have to defend myself anymore. I know what I'm doing, and I just want to do it, and I'm able to do it. And at a certain point, it's so thrilling. Now, believe me, if my graduate students talk like this, I'd say, you know, you have to build a foundation. And, you have to know your history. You have to understand why the work has an idea and how to articulate that idea. But at this point, I feel very comfortable with the fact that I want to work in midair.
Well, you're playing your instrument, which is what you always say to me. But, you know, I remember when we went in the studio at Carol Dunham before his last show, and we were up visiting, and, you know, Tip just said, you know, at this point, no one comes into the studio. Maybe Barbara goes in or something like that, but you're just playing at that point because you've been doing that work for so long that you kind of know there's an intuition that comes out of having learned your history and written about your own work and kind of. Would you talk about the relationship of drawings to the sculpture? Because none of the drawings are on view, but of course I think I love the drawings. You know, I'm always interested in how they flatten out in some ways because a lot of the same imagery, but you kind of, I don't know, there's something about them that's very pleasurable. And I think that what we were talking about before, how when you photograph the sculptures, they don't quite break down orthographically. That means you can't piece them back together based on images that you've taken. So, but in the drawings, there is this sense that you can capture the whole image. Would you discuss your drawings?
Well, before I do that, I just want to continue one thought that from the last question, because hopefully some of you were in New York recently and saw the Picasso show. And if you didn't, it's, for me, like one of the greatest art experiences I've ever had.
And I mean, me too.
Yeah. And the thing that I took from Picasso, the Picasso show, I mean, is the thing I was sort of trying to say before. Like, when you look at Picasso, you see that his decision-making was so incredibly sophisticated, and yet you could tell he never sweated. It was immediate, but the decisions looked so careful about symmetry and symmetry breaking and in formal relationships. You'd think that he'd have to like spend all this time like working that. No, they were always done in an instant.
But
and
remember,
that is, I mean, he's Picasso, so.
But you know, Picasso's making representational, beautiful paintings that look like Velázquez at 13 years old.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's really hard. I think once you're in that language, his father's an art teacher.
Yeah. No, but I just meant that sense of like being able to feel free.
But your immediacy, I think, comes later.
Yeah.
I mean, before that, he's trying out different styles. He's making paintings that look like Toulouse-Lautrec.
Yeah, no,
you know,
absolutely. No, it's not a young man's game, or young woman's game, for that matter.
Do you want to talk about the drawings? Or
Yeah, sure. No. Oh, yeah, I mean, you want to have questions or something?
Well, I wanted to end actually with spoonfuls.
Oh, yes.
I love the spoonfuls, which is one of the pieces in the gallery, and it's these 3 ladles with objects, and I think that there's such a generous gesture. Will you talk to me about the development of those works? And I know that you're working on a whole show that's going to go up next month on 57th Street.
Yeah. Yes, and you were very helpful about the spoonfuls, because when there's a piece in this show called Spoonfuls with these 3 little spoons, and as Andrianna says, I'm going to do a show next month of this group of work. It's interesting because I never work in series, so this is kind of, not that these are series, but it's a suite, let's say. I had this idea, particularly given the art world, because I'm very involved in it, I suppose, in my community. I don't love a lot of what's going on, and I do love a lot of what's going on simultaneously, but certainly sensationalism and spectacle are not the direction that I am cozy with or happy about. And I was thinking, like, aside from, and it continues on from this idea about intimacy that I had, but in this age of sensationalism and spectacle, I was thinking, wouldn't it be great to just have this kind of humble, quiet, small offering, like just a little one thing, you know? So I often work on little funny things, and I don't know what I'm going to do with it, or I find funny things, and I just thought it would be not quite like sketches, but kind of a parallel group of work where it would be like here. You know, I talk about Judd's here. That's the big here of shared space. But just this, it's like, I told Andrianna this afternoon, and I think this is really where it comes from. When I was a little kid, my grandmother, who lived in Levittown, which was like a fabricated place in the 50s, had her own organic garden. This is way before organic gardens were, you know, popular. And what was really great, and she kept bees and did it. So she used to give my sister and I little spoonfuls of honey. And it was such a great pleasure. And it was also like a health thing, you know, like a tonic, like just a little here. And there's something so tender about that. And I just thought it had a certain quiet, wonderful way of presenting an idea. And also, I liked the humility of it, and I liked the kind of surprise of it, and I really liked the accessibility of it. You know, because sometimes art can be so alienating in its way, and one of the things that I'm really interested in, this also came to me late, I'm obsessed with Calder. Everybody thinks they know Calder, but I think Calder is an absolutely unsung genius for being one of the most famous artists in the world.
Well, Duchamp thought he was a genius.
Yeah, no, and Duchamp named the mobiles.
Yeah.
But the one thing about Calder that I realized late, and I want this in my work. Of course, I always wanted intellectual rigor, and I wanted, you know, invention, but what Calder has is joy. I want joy. And that's a lot of what the color's about, and the kind of surprising form, and the way you turn the sculpture and it has a completely different look that you had no idea what it was. And if I can bring, I know I can get that joy, but if I can bring you that joy, and also if I can bring you that sense of being compelled by this notion of, like, what is this thing and what am I doing here? Even asking the question, what is this thing? I actually feel like that could be a quietly gentle, profound experience, so that when you go out in the world and you see other things that you don't understand, you might have the echo of that experience with this funny little sculpture as a way of helping you approach things in a more open way. And therefore, I think my work is political. It's a consciousness-raising device. And I hope that that can bring you a way of entering into this peculiar experience privately and maybe aid you in having a more open mind for the rest of it.
That's really wonderful, John. I think that's a good place to end. Does anyone have questions in the audience?
I have a question. I've followed your work since the early 80s.
Thank you.
And the pieces that I was fascinated with, you talked about briefly as it relates to the computer and as you were bending space as more as computer imagery and mathematical topologies become more and more available. Do you reflect back on those pieces that you made back then and think that people would then start making the connection to what you were doing?
Well, that would be a little pretentious of me to say, but I did do a lot of things with non-Euclidean geometry and topological deformation before AutoCAD was invented. That's true. The thing that interested me about topological deformation wasn't so much that I'm a mathematician. I'm not. What I was interested in is that bending, twisting, tangling, deforming, and stretching are all physical things that we understand viscerally. Everybody knows what a knot feels like. So I felt that these forms, particularly in the age of Euclidean geometry with minimalism and things like that, that these forms actually resonated a new kind of physical sensation that everyone could understand, both the sexy side and the kind of torturous side. And I thought that these were resonant forms. And also, on another side of the coin, they were very challenging to make. It was really fun. You know, I had to figure out how to make a double curved surface. Really hard. And let me tell you, the concave is twice as hard as the convex. So you give yourself these challenges. And I just thought that I guess the easiest way to say it is that I was fascinated with the idea in non-Euclidean geometry that it was based on a new model. Like Euclid's model was that two lines are parallel ad infinitum. That was his fifth postulate. Well, then you learn that on a sphere, two lines intersect because a sphere is a different model than a plane. So suddenly this is sounding a lot like the world. You know, people have different fundamental premises of how they look at things. And if you change the premise, the behavior changes. So I thought that that was very resonant and rich, not so much scientific, but as a corollary for the visceral and the emotional.
And I think that really speaks to the title of the exhibition, Possible in Principle.
Yeah, I know we didn't talk about the title. Yeah, I mean, the possible in principle, I think, it's kind of a beckoning, I don't want to say joke, but it's a beckoning call. Like, are these things even possible? You know, and I hope that you have that sense. And in many ways, a lot of topological deformation forms, Mobius strips and things like that, are all about an impossible surface. They're often called impossible or endless surfaces. And I found that to be poetically resonant, not only complicated in terms of form or mathematics. And possible in principle is kind of like also it's a little bit of a, what would you call it, like a taunt.
Gamut,
Yeah, like, is it possible?
Gauntlet.
And maybe it's only possible in some strange imaginary construction. Although, as Judd says, it's here. And I love that contradiction. You know, it can't exist, and it exists, and boy, that sounds a lot like the way I am in my inner world and in the real world at the same time, which is what we all are.
Someone else had a question over here? Michael?
I'm really curious about the scale shift post-80s. And you talked about it in terms of the investigation of the potential for a different kind of space. And in terms of intimacy, like leaning in, which I know you described as the way one might lean into a baby or a lover or a book, which I love, by the way, that description. I'm curious about...
You heard my other lecture.
I'm curious about its how it exists as an act of adoration. To make something small is a way to adore it, and I'm curious if you have thought about it in that regard.
You mean, am I in love with my sculpture?
Yeah.
Or is there something erotic about the sculpture, kind of, is there aura in something small? Like I think of Brancusi polishing those heads.
Yeah, well, Brancusi definitely was in love. Actually,
Yeah.
there's a famous story of Bernini when he was old. Bernini was up on the scaffolding, and he was quite old. And all his assistants were in there, and they said, Maestro, come down, you're going to hurt yourself. You shouldn't be up there. And he said, get away from me. He said, you don't understand. I'm in love.
St. Teresa next to see? Maybe.
How can I answer that? I don't see adoration as a subject, but sure, I mean, when things are going well in the studio, it doesn't get any better than that.
Any other questions? Yeah?
I personally like jazz, and I want to know how it may influence some of the work you do. I just want you to speak about that a little bit, because I think that's kind of great, because that's kind of what I use as a tool for when I'm doing my own process. So I'm just curious on what your take is.
Yeah. Well, do you know who Ornette Coleman is?
I'm inexperienced with artists as far as that. I just kind of listen to everything.
Listen to Ornette Coleman, The Shape of Jazz to Come. It was a premise-changing moment.
There's this thing that happens with jazz at Coleman, right? So before you have more structured more structure, and then there's this improvisation that happens with Ornette Coleman. I mean, he just passed away. It's very big
Yeah.
for many artists. I know for Stanley
Yeah.
Whitney and for others.
I mean, I can't say Ornette Coleman was the absolute first. I would really give it to John Coltrane, but Coltrane is a bridge. Coleman is very complicated, very raucous, and to many ears very unpleasant. And that actually is one thing I liked about him. You know, I mean, talking about the 80s work, I often said that my work from that period, I don't feel it quite now, was like a chicken bone stuck in your throat. You know, it just didn't go down easy. And that was something I was quite interested in. I'm sort of over that. But Ornette Coleman was, I guess the easiest way to talk about it is he's like Pollock. He was like the first one who, and actually Pollock is more like Coltrane in the sense that Charlie Parker and then up to Coltrane would often take some kind of melody, often a standard, I Love Paris or a Cole Porter tune or whatever, you know, Jingle Bells, whatever it was, and use that as a structure to improvise off of. So it was about cantilever. How far can I go off of this known place? And Coleman was really, and maybe Sun Ra, were the first to just sort of make it up in midair. And I just love that. I love that as a metaphor. That's what an artwork is. I mean, basically, you know, you're just making it up in midair, unless you have a prescribed armature. For example, observational drawing. You set up a flower pot, you have a prescribed armature, and you try to work that towards something else. That's the Matissean model.
But that's so conceptual because I think you have such an intimate relationship with jazz, though, like more biographical.
What do you mean?
Like you just listen to it while you're making work.
Yeah. Well, I listen to lots of things. I mean, I listen to Indian music, and
That's
I listen
true.
to, I mean, I have a very wide musical, I listen to music all day long because I'm in the studio all day long. But there is something about jazz also that, this is a funny thing to say because I was just talking about Calder and accessibility and joy, which I really believe in. But I also believe in difficulty. You know, like when you read, the first time you read like James Joyce Ulysses, or the first time you hear Schoenberg, like it's challenging. And I think that that's very edifying. And it bothers me now that art is not, and Jeff Koons is, you know, kind of an interesting character in this case because he sneaks up on you. You know, it's so sort of seductive that you don't and art should be difficult. Art should be difficult. And the only way to understand art's difficulty is to learn more about art. And I tell this to my students all the time, and I think this is really the confusing part, is that art is terribly personal, but it's also not. It's part of a conversation. It's part of a field of study. It's part of a community involvement. And, you know, those things shouldn't be, again, binary. They should be somehow fused in a way that makes something new.
So if there are no other questions, I'm going to thank John for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
so
Thank
much.
you, Andrea.